morning, everybody. My name is Lane. I'm a student at the Kingwood-Honors Lone Star College campus. And today we are going to be talking about mold and rot and fungus, and most especially garbage. And I know not everyone finds that as interesting and neat as I do, but it is really important, not just nationally, but also globally. Now, just after World War II, when plastic started to be produced more commercially, we were only making maybe 2 million tons per year globally. And then by 2019, we're making 400 million tons per year, a number which is set to triple by 2060. Now, how much of this is attributed to the United States? Well, it's about 12%. And that doesn't seem like such a stark and surprising number until you consider that we're only 5% of the global population. So that means that the United States is one of the largest generators of municipal solid waste, particularly plastic, in the world. Now, I wanted to find out if we could use something natural, like fungi, the natural process, digestive process of fungi, to break down these complex chemical structures that are present in our non-biodegradable waste that just keep stacking and growing. Now, in order to do that, I needed to establish an analytical foundation on 2 topics. First, the digestive process of fungi. What exactly are they capable of, and what are the boundaries of that? And then second, I needed to learn about the municipal solid waste system. How are we storing our waste, and is the landfill situation something that can even hospitably host a biodegradable implant? And then once we've established those 2 things, we can talk about implications and predictions for the future. And we may well find that the answer has been right beneath us the entire time. This is a mycelium network. This is how, well, this is essentially fungi, as it actually is. Most of you will know a mushroom, but that's just a fruiting body, and it's really just a chitinous membrane around more of these fibers. These are what really matter. This is the brain and body of a fungi. Now, fungi are heterotrophic saprotrophs, meaning that they have to eat, but they don't have a body. They just have these tendrils. So it has to be small enough for them to absorb. So what they do is they secrete these individual tendrils called hyphae, which will secrete a lignocellulolytic enzyme once they detect carbon. That's a fancy word for this thing. I see carbon, and I'm going to eat it. So that's what it does, and it will break it down into soluble individual elements that it can then absorb into the whole body. Now, a man named J.J. Cooney wanted to know the same thing as me in 1999. He wanted to know if fungi was capable of breaking down a complex hydrocarbon as a single source of nutrients. What he found was yes. In his study, he produced dozens of fruiting bodies, evidence of a very happy mycelium. Now, this has developed in modern day into cleaning pollution from oil spills, both in soil and in flotation devices. So we know that it's incredibly versatile. But can it work on solid waste? Let's take a look at a few simulation landfill studies to get an idea of what the exact degradation capability of a landfill is. Now, this was a study done in Mexico City where they took 3 samples of plastics, high-density polyethylene, one that oxidizes, and a biodegradable Ecovio brand. And they left it in a simulated landfill, so compacted, deoxygenated, and dark. And they left it like that for 854 days. And these were the structural differences after. Very minimal, but still there. However, is it chemical? And to find that out, we need to look at something called an FTIR spectroscopy test. Now, what this is it uses infrared and vibrations to place a signature on specific functional groups within a chemical structure. And you can tell which chemical structure is where and what type and the strength based on the shape of the peak and swell and where it lands on the table. However, that doesn't really matter. All we actually really need to know to determine if there was true chemical change indicating degradation is a significant difference between the control and sample lines. Now, if you look over here to the HDPE, you'll notice that these lines are remarkably similar. And you'll have the same thing for the oxidizing. However, if you look at Ecovio, you will notice that there's a very slight change, but this is biodegradable, and we knew that. So these are expected results. But what if we could induce the microorganisms that are already present in a landfill to break down these highly recalcitrant, non-biodegradable materials? This is another study that was taken where they placed starch over a styrofoam cup and they left it for a year to see if they could induce the microorganisms to target the natural starch, because they like organic materials, not inorganic like plastic. But if we can coat the plastic, maybe they'll want to eat it. The answer was no. They didn't want to eat it at all. These 2 FTIR spectroscopies are exactly the same, indicating no chemical change. And the only structural change that you'll notice is some slight discoloration, but that's just the natural aeration of styrofoam and the tendency for leachate to fall. So we've learned that nothing can degrade in a landfill on its own within the system that is already in place. But I want to invite you to take a closer look at the monomer structures of the 6 main types of plastic. And you'll notice that the common denominator here is carbon, something that we know is all fungi needs to thrive. But can it take down something as chemically complex as polystyrene? You can think of polystyrene as the big bad of plastics. This specific type of plastic will not break down for 500,000 to 1 million years in nature. It has one of the longest residency times of any material. But if you look at the chemical structure, it's just hydrocarbons. And we've already proven that fungi can do that. So theoretically, it stands up. But can it do it in practice? Now let's take a look at one last study that was done in the open-air dump sites around Mumbai. What they did is they took fungal aero samples and bacterial aero samples from above the dump sites, and they tested them with a Congo red strain test. And all that is it verifies that these specific samples can detect this as a hydrocarbon source of nutrients, and they activate the enzymes. So the Congo red strain test identifies that they can do that, and that's how they selected their samples. And then they put them in a liquid agar and left it for about 30 days. And what we found was sample NG007, Pestalozziopsis microspore. It is a type of white rot fungi that usually grows in the Amazon, but for whatever reason, it was above these dump sites in spore form. But they found that it could break down styrofoam up to 74% efficiency within only 30 days. That's 12 million times faster than anything we have currently and anything that exists in a landfill. And the spectroscopy test will corroborate. We have significant difference both in the first and second half, indicating that it was not just structural loss, but also chemical. So we have a visible representation of true chemical degradation. So if we have something that works, why is not everyone already doing it? Because we have this exponential waste problem and more produced every single year, and it's just going to landfills where it'll sit forever. So if we have a solution that works, why aren't we doing it? Well, that could be due to profit, because the MSW system is not profitable, but it is also very difficult to test due to the regional and developmental national differences in the contents of landfills. Regionally, you'll see differences based on income, and nationally, you'll see differences based on the developmental status. Like the United States has way more paper in our waste than, say, India, which has mostly about 60% organic waste. So the contents of landfills are incredibly vast and different based on every single one. So that's really hard to replicate and study. And we found that it can work in labs, but is it enough if it can only work in labs? We need it to work within the systems that are already in place. So if it can't do that, we're right back to where we started at the beginning of this PowerPoint with 1.2 billion tons produced annually by 2060 and no way to reduce it. Unless we can secure funding, unless we can secure laws, like strict bans on the things that are being produced. And more than that, we need public perception. Most people don't even know this is a problem. We just throw things away, it's out of sight and out of mind. But if we can do all three of those things, then we stand a chance at tackling the waste problem in a responsible and anticipatory manner instead of just reactionary. These are my references. Thank you so much.